In some areas, Russian forces outnumbered the Ukrainians by as much as 8-1. Moscow's dominance on the front continues, and Vladimir Putin's objective remains unchanged: to break Ukraine using Russia's oldest strategy, throwing endless waves of recruits at the enemy, no matter the cost. To paraphrase a classic line, this is the sacrifice Putin is willing to make. But this exchange is no longer one-sided. Ukraine too is trying to break its opponent, not by marching on Moscow, like Napoleon once did, but by striking with precision at the most sensitive points of the Russian state. Kyiv's campaign of drone and missile attacks on refineries shows no sign of slowing, and now extends to fuel depots or power substations. Russia's economy is trying hard not to show pain, but it is getting increasingly difficult. The country is sliding toward stagflation. Let's dig into it. Over the past 2 weeks, the list of Ukrainian strikes on Russian refineries has grown by 7 more sites. Lukoil refineries are back in the crosshairs. In Volgograd, hit 5 times since early August, and in Kstovo, the 3rd strike in 3 months. Along with 4 Rosneft facilities, Saratov, Novokuybishevsk, Ryazan, and 2 newcomers to the list, a refinery in Makhachkala, Dagestan, and Marisky in the Republic of Mariel. To put the scale in perspective, from April through the end of July, Russian refineries were struck 3 times in total. Since the start of August, that number has jumped to 47. We report Ukraine's long-range campaign so systematically for a reason. This may be Kyiv's single most important strategic card right now. Perhaps the most consequential since the war began. Its effects are hard to predict, but it delivers something Ukraine has not had at this scale before: the ability to export the war directly into Russian territory, and to methodically degrade one of the aggressor's main economic pillars. Crucially, Kyiv is doing this without permanent oversight or permission from a third party, and in many cases with the benefit of US intelligence. Fuel prices in some regions have risen 30-50% over recent months, according to local analysis from Ulyanovsk. The situation is not yet catastrophic, but it is clearly noticeable and increasingly painful across many parts of the Federation. And it is not only refineries. Ukraine has also struck export terminals, pumping stations, fuel depots, gas facilities, transformer substations, power plants, ammunition factories, and chemical plants. There have been at least 17 such attacks in the past 3 weeks, plotted on the map here, though the list is almost certainly incomplete. Of particular concern for Moscow is the rising tempo of strikes on transformer substations, which may signal a new phase in Kyiv's campaign. Yet it is important to stay sober in assessing this situation. For Russia's energy system to move from strained to catastrophic, the current pace and scale of Ukrainian strikes would have to continue for several more months. And so far, we are only 3 months in. The Russians are trying to adapt, installing new protective systems around facilities, but their effectiveness remains highly questionable. Donald Trump's new sanctions on Rosneft and Lukoil are also not helping. Russia's 2 largest oil companies, together responsible for half of the country's crude output. This is no symbolic move. Moscow genuinely fears these measures. The US has warned all foreign entities, including banks, refineries, ports, and shipping companies, that continuing business with these Russian oil giants could expose them to secondary sanctions. Washington has given Rosneft's and Lukoil's partners 1 month to wind down operations and terminate existing contracts. As a result, while the sanctions will formally take effect in a few weeks, both firms are already cut off from payments. as their accounts have been frozen. This means not only major disruptions to their daily operations, but also the likely sale of foreign assets. Lukoil owns refineries in Bulgaria and Romania, as well as a large stake in a Dutch refinery. Lukoil's network of gas stations across the Balkans, its fuel depots and associated infrastructure are also on the line. Even more painful could be the forced sale of its 75% stake in the West Kurna 2 oil field in Iraq, one of the largest in the world. These are the first Russia sanctions introduced under the Trump administration, but they hit hard. Since the announcement, Rosneft and Lukoil have lost over $11 billion in market value. And yet perhaps the most consequential is the potential fallout for trade with India. New Delhi buys roughly 40% of Russia's discounted crude exports. According to Reuters, many Indian refineries have already paused new orders following Washington's decision to sanction two major Russian exporters. Quote, "Privately owned Reliance Industries will stop importing oil under its long-term deal to buy nearly 500,000 barrels per day of crude from Russian oil major Rosneft, after the oil producer was sanctioned by the United States," two sources with direct knowledge of the matter said on Thursday. Unquote. Of course, once contract frameworks are adjusted to the new reality, India will want to resume purchases. For now, it is a moment for lawyers. Everything ultimately depends on how effectively the sanctions are implemented and enforced. But this is not the end of the Trump administration's offensive. Matthew Whitaker, the US ambassador to NATO, said Washington expects Hungary, Slovakia, and Turkey to begin phasing out Russian oil imports. Budapest, however, is already exploring ways to circumvent the new US measures, as it is heavily dependent on supplies from Lukoil and Rosneft. Bloomberg reports the sanctions push came from Secretary of State Marco Rubio after plans for a peace meeting in Budapest fell through. The EU is meanwhile advancing a 19th sanctions package, this time targeting an additional 117 vessels from the quote shadow fleet, bringing the total to some 560 ships. Brussels also plans stepped-up inspections of vessels that could serve Russia's shadow fleet. A declaration from the European External Action Service, EEAC, aims to crack down on false ships registrations and to sanction firms that enable the shadow fleet. Insurers, brokers, and ship management companies among them. How does this scheme work in practice? The blog Oil Not Dead lays it out clearly. Roughly 70% of Russia's current output, about 9.4 million barrels a day, is controlled by state and state firms, Rosneft, Gazprom, and Lukoil. After losing Western trading partners, much of the trading activity migrated to Dubai, where in the DMCCC, Dubai Multi-Commodity Center, a shell company can be set up for around $15,000 to handle sanctioned oil deals. A web of shell firms and intermediaries, often former London and Geneva traders, now execute transactions on behalf of Russian firms. The key mechanism is multi-layered ownership transfers. A barrel is formally reassigned 2 or 3 times between the port of Primorsk and the buyer in India or China. Invoices, bills of lading, and guarantees are repeatedly rewritten to erase traces of Rosneft. Estimates put the shadow fleet at anywhere from 600 to as many as 1,400 vessels. The oil is still flowing, but at a growing cost. The transport is handled by aging, often uninsured tankers flying neutral flags. Payments bypass the dollar system, conducted instead in rupees, yuan, gold, or cryptocurrency. As a result, Russian crude continues to move, but at a steeper discounts and with rising logistical costs. The new US and EU sanctions aim not so much at curbing production itself, but at choking this web of intermediaries by targeting the ships, bunkering services, and financing channels that keep the trade alive. The problem isn't the barrels, It is the people and institutions that let them move. The sector's total losses since 2022 are estimated at over $100 billion. Altogether, the refinery strikes and sanctions are casting a long shadow over Russia's federal economy. Many factories are switching to 4-day or even 3-day workweeks. The cuts have hit the railway division of Uralvagonzavod due to weak demand. St. Petersburg Kirovets tractor plant due to tractor sales down 20-25%. Kamaz truck plant, truck sales down 60%. Lada car factory, car sales down 25%. Rosneft plant, combine harvester sales down 59%. And engine makers, Avtodiesel and Yazda, both facing a wave of cancelled orders. The anxiety is spreading into the financial sector. Since June, Russians have been pulling cash from banks en masse, fearing liquidity issues. The government is issuing more domestic bonds to plug the gaps, and debt servicing costs are surging. Russia now spends over 10% of its federal budget, roughly $40 billion a year, just to service its debt. Kremlin propaganda likes to boast that the country's overall debt is only 16.5% of GDP, compared to, for example, 130% in the US or 58% in Poland. But the key difference is cost. Russia's borrowing rates are far higher. Nominally, Moscow's debt is half of Poland's, yet its servicing burden is twice as heavy. To ease the pressure, the finance ministry has raised value-added tax to 22% and trimmed interest rates by half a percentage point to 16.5%, in an effort to give the wheezing economy a bit of air. What does it all mean? The Center for Macroeconomic Analysis and Short-Term Forecasting, CMASF, founded in 2001 by Russia's current defense minister, Andrei Belousov, warns of a looming recession, or even stagflation, a mix of rising prices and slowing growth. The Bank of Russia itself has confirmed this risk. In a comprehensive report published on October 24th, the bank states that in a quote risky scenario, Russia's GDP is projected to fall by even 3.5% next year, and by a further 2-3% the year after. At its peak, in the fourth quarter of 2026, the rate of decline will be at 6-7%. Official inflation will rise to around 20%. This scenario assumes stronger sanctions pressure, oil prices dropping below $40 per barrel, and a consequent loss of more than $100 billion in export revenues. Even in the optimistic baseline scenario, the Bank of Russia describes what Western economists would call stagflation, high inflation coupled with minimal growth and restricted credit. Growth in this scenario is expected to be between 0.5 and 1%, although it should be noted that this is largely driven by, quote, unproductive arms production. Interest rates are expected to remain at 13 to 19% over the next 2 years, to reflect the real inflation rate. Against this backdrop, it is little surprise that even war contracts are being scaled back. Many Russian regions have slashed enlistment bonuses by as much as 80%. In Saratov, according to RIA Novosti, they have fallen fivefold. In Orenburg, the same pattern holds, from the equivalent of about $28,000 down to just $5,000. Cuts in volunteer pay are becoming a reality, despite the war being an absolute priority in the federal budget, a far bigger one than official figures suggest. As Bronisław Sławczew of the University of California notes, the Kremlin is spending far more than the declared 7% of GDP on the war. We covered this in detail in our earlier episode on Russia's economy. Once hidden expenditures are included, nearly 30% of the federal budget is classified, total spending rises to an estimated $297 billion, or roughly 14% of GDP. Russia's economic resilience is therefore an illusion, built on concealed wartime financing. Banks are propping up the defense industry with cheap loans, 5 to 8%, while tightening credit for the civilian economy. choking production and inflating hidden debt. According to Sławchev, when the war ends, this system will collapse. The loss of military contracts will expose massive holes in the banking sector, forcing the government to bail it out at the expense of taxpayers and social spending. It is yet another reason Moscow is in no hurry to end the war. And so, from the perspective of Russia's economy, the war must go on. And perhaps the same can be said from the battlefield's perspective. The Kremlin continues to pressure its two main lines of imperial warfare: sustained air assaults and relentless frontline pressure. On the first point, according to Ukraińska Prawda, Russia has recently shifted its tactics against Ukraine's power grid, moving from sporadic, high-intensity barrages on multiple regions to a methodical region-by-region destruction campaign. The primary targets are border oblasts, such as Sumy and Chernihiv, but also Kharkiv, Zaporizhia, and Mykolaiv. Attacks typically begin with swarms of 10 to 40 drones, followed by missile attacks. The Kremlin's goal is to trigger a domino effect, splitting Ukraine's grid into two zones: an energy-starved east and an energy-surplus west, connected only by damaged transmission lines. As winter approaches, officials are preparing for possible rolling blackouts: 4 hours without power, 2 with, depending on the region. The problem is that Ukraine's defensive preparations are lagging. A program to secure roughly 80 high-voltage substations remains incomplete. Amid personnel reshuffles and funding disputes, protection of critical infrastructure still falls far short of what the country urgently needs. And the frontline offers little relief. After a relatively calm September, October has turned into one of the most difficult months for Ukraine's armed forces since 2022. The situation is dire, especially around Pokrovsk, now the focal point of Russia's main offensive. Russian troops have encircled the city on 3 sides, leaving only a narrow supply corridor roughly 7 to even 3 kilometers wide. All bridges have been destroyed and evacuating the wounded has become nearly impossible. Ukrainian medics report a severe shortage of engineering equipment and personnel needed to build temporary crossings. Heavy fighting continues across the city. Russian forces have entered the southeastern outskirts of Myrnograd and eastern Pokrovsk itself. The city's fall now appears inevitable. According to Captain Grigory Shapoval, Russian troops enjoy a 10-to-1 advantage in drones and 8-to-1 advantage in manpower in this sector, a ratio confirmed by President Volodymyr Zelensky, who nonetheless stressed that, quote, "Despite this, Russia has failed to achieve its objectives," unquote. A well-ordered retreat is now highly unlikely, and the armed forces of Ukraine will retreat in panic once again, as happened in Bakhmut and Avdiivka. The difference this time is that Russian FPV drones now have much greater dominance. The second critical hotspot is the left bank of the Oskil River, near Kupiansk, where Ukrainian troops now find themselves in a situation reminiscent of Russia's own position in Kherson back in 2022. Destroyed ferry crossings and relentless drone strikes on supply lines are hampering ammunition deliveries and medical evacuations. Ukrainian engineers rebuild bridges only for them to be destroyed again within hours by artillery fire and glide bombs. Kremlin forces are also active near Konstantinivka and Women. Ukraine continues to launch limited counterattacks. In recent days, it has retaken Kucheryv Yar and Suchetskie near Dobropilia, inflicting significant losses on Russian forces, which, by some estimates, have already surpassed 1 million casualties since the invasion began. That is the assessment of The Economist, in a piece tellingly titled, quote, "Russia's latest big Ukraine offensive gains next to nothing. Again," unquote. The authors go so far as to claim that Russian losses on the front outnumber Ukraine's by roughly 5-to-1. Their findings draw on around 200 credible estimates from Western governments and independent researchers, though some analysts believe these numbers may be on the high side. According to the magazine, total Russian casualties may now be approaching 1.5 million killed and wounded. As the article notes, quote, "Our meta-estimates suggest that from the beginning of the full-scale invasion to January of this year, Russian casualties amounted to 640,000 to 877,000 soldiers, of whom 137,000 to 228,000 have died. By October 13th, those totals had risen by almost 60% to 984,000 to even 1,438,000 casualties, including 190 to 480,000 dead." Unquote. One chart in particular captures the stark imbalance, when compared with another showing Russia's territorial gains since the war began. Nearly 1.5 million Russian soldiers have been killed or wounded, and yet Moscow controls less territory today than it did nearly 3 years ago. And so Ukrainians know that the war, in one form or another, will drag on for a long time. It is in this context that the potential Kyiv-Stockholm agreement for the delivery of Gripen fighter jets should be understood. Under a letter of intent, Ukraine is expressing interest in acquiring as many as 100 to 150 Swedish jets in the years to come. The first aircraft are expected to arrive in early 2026. The Gripen is seen as a platform better suited to Ukraine's conditions than the F-16. It is easier to service, capable of operating from regular highways, and generally more adaptable to local infrastructure. The main challenges remain financing, with proposals to use foreign Russian assets and production capacity. Saab plans to double its output, but until now has produced only about 18 aircraft per year maximum. Interestingly, Sweden is reportedly open to locating part of the production in Ukraine. Yet price and flexibility aren't the only reasons Kyiv has chosen Stockholm over Washington. Two countries share a deep strategic alignment in their view of Russia, meaning President Zelensky could pursue this partnership without fearing the political mood swings of, for example, Washington. The war therefore continues, because it must. Even Donald Trump, who dreams of a Nobel Peace Prize, has found that neither persuasion nor pressure can bring Russia to the table. For the Kremlin to end the war would mean admitting to its people that the Federation gained a sliver of wrecked territory, roughly the size of the Nizhny Novgorod Oblast, while destroying its economy, alienating major trading partners, and incurring some 1.5 million casualties. It also has forged a mortal enemy armed up to its teeth, just nearby its underbelly, a foe that would view any future Russian distraction, say involvement in a Chinese war over Taiwan, as an opportunity to reclaim seized ground. A pause to regroup and strike later looks a bit more plausible, but Kyiv won't squander that time either. It will fortify positions, lay mines, replenish material, and give the army a chance to recover. So the Kremlin is betting that methodically taking land, kilometer after kilometer, will eventually break Ukrainian morale, and that the economy will withstand the internal and external shocks raining down on it. Quite risky. As Admiral Sir Tony Radakin, the former UK chief of the defense staff, put it ironically, quote, "If a snail had left Rostov-on-Don in Russia on the 24th of February 2022, by now it would have crossed all the way through Ukraine, and it will be halfway through Poland." Unquote. Russia, in other words, is slower than a snail. Paradoxically, Russia is not alone in seeking to break an opponent. Ukraine pursues a near-mirror strategy. By steadily striking critical Russian infrastructure, Kyiv hopes to trigger an unexpected crisis that could fracture the federal state, or even bring it to its knees. That is why Ukraine accepts gradual withdrawals. It is buying time to squeeze the Kremlin with its long-range campaign. In the end, this is a war of attrition, a test of which society can endure a higher threshold of pain.